Hey, sustainability through civility when covering controversial issues has always been an interest of mine. Starting back in the 1990s, with the Persian Gulf War, my research addressed the need for context, especially when covering ongoing conflicts. Then in the 2000s, I looked at coverage of conflict related to women's health issues. For example, the breast implant controversy. I looked at the kinds of sources that newspapers used and whether or not they had balance in their news reports. Most recently, in 2019, at Iowa State University, we hosted a summit on media civility for media managers and professionals. This directly preceded the presidential primary, so managers were really concerned about how to cover conflict in increasingly uncivil environments. Then in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum with the death of George Floyd. And here's the timeline. What we're seeing increasingly in the U.S. is that everybody looks at highly political issues in a binary way. And while media managers at the Civility Summit discuss the importance of empathy and reporting belonging, values, they also discuss the importance of appealing to audiences. And in this kind of environment, this is challenging. For example, here are headlines from CNN and Fox, where media organizations will cover some stories and not others. CNN, for example, won't cover the Fox story that God was left out of the Biden National Day Prayer Proclamation. They also both cover the voting suppression story in a very different way. So the purpose of our study was to analyze competing national newspaper coverage of conflict while seeking larger consumer segments, if possible. And we wanted to identify whether or not newspapers differentiate their product in terms of sources and framing. So taking a look at topics like that you see in the media, these are the stories about Black Lives Matter, stories on violence and statistics that come out, such as if you're Black, you're more likely than a white person to be killed by police, regardless of the situation. Or the other statistic, another statistic is that people who have killed police are disproportionately Black. So how do you cover this kind of information? And where you're in the middle as a reporter, and how do you cover this information fairly and avoid increasing conflict? We found literature on framing to be helpful for our study. Literature on peace journalism is also a way to provide or to operationalize the variable of bias. The Pew Research Institute talks about framing in news. As you know, framing impacts public understanding, public policy, and opinion. They also found that local papers, like the Des Moines Register, tend to rely on traditional straight news accounts and try to explain things more, whereas national newspapers are more interpretive in nature and try to put news into a larger perspective. Here's an interesting point, though. Increasingly, news originates from decisions made in the newsroom rather than events from outside. And I think this is important for all the classes that I teach. Harlow looked at ways to analyze content in terms of conflict frames. So he said there's a riot frame, a confrontation frame, a spectacle frame, a debate frame. So he found that alternative outlets like Newsmax had decreased odds of publishing or airing stories with the confrontation frame and increased odds of using the debate frame. So going back to the debate frame, that is focused on social critique of the movement, presence of protesters, demands. Whereas stories published by media outlets in a region different than the location of the protest increase the odds of using the spectacle frame. And here's the spectacle frame, focuses on emotions, drama, or unusualness of the protests. Harlow also found that fewer conservative articles included the riot frame. And so that is focusing on protesters and the riots, looting, damage to property or society. We decided to use Urso and Miller's bias continuum on a 1 to 5 scale. Our stories falling more into the incompatible frame, all the way up to 5, where they're following more into a compatible frame. And here's definitions of what incompatible and compatible meant. So conflict is a tug of war, constantly. Compromise not possible. That would be incompatible. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, equity, conflicts are textualized, culture is highlighted, so promoting understanding. That's the continuum. So we used content analysis as our method, and we conducted both a computational and a manual content analysis. Our sample included stories from the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and our time frame was when Black Lives Matter stories surged, and that was May 31st to June 6th. The variables we were interested in: word usage, source usage, and bias. And again, bias was operationalized on a 1 to 5 point incompatible compatible scale. We conducted 2 pre-tests, and overall coder reliability was 95%. We collected our data from Factiva, which is on the ISU website. It's a great source, a great resource for collecting data. We collected all stories during that time period, but we only used the reporter-generated news stories. We eliminated opinion pieces and syndicated columns. And that left us with about 199 stories that we analyzed. So the computational analysis gave us great ideas on framing and issues of emphasis. We used JUMP, which is available for students, undergraduate and graduate students. And here's some of the word clouds JUMP was able to produce. So if you take a look at these, you can see the word usage was very similar in all 3 newspapers. Trump stood out a little more in the New York Times, which is at the top. We conducted a manual content analysis on story and headline bias. No significant differences in headline bias were found. Wall Street Journal coverage fell a little more often into the compatible category, where conflicts are textualized. There was a significant difference in story bias, however, with the New York Times and USA Today more often dramatizing the conflict. Here's an example of compatible versus incompatible word usage. So compatible would be stories made up of sentences such as, New York Times here, hundreds of students engaged in thoughtful civil discussion about these very important and challenging questions, versus focusing on the drama. The fence came down and hell broke loose, firecrackers running, a plume of tear gas, its canisters clattering, burning of faces, eyes, streams of tears and mucus. You can see very different kind of word usage. So we also looked at the sources used in the stories, and here's a list of the sources we coded for: police, business, unofficial. Unofficial was a large category for all newspapers, and New York Times did particularly well, interviewing sources, for example, at the scenes of the protest. These were the sources, though, that were significantly different. The Wall Street Journal used police and Democrats more often as sources. The New York Times interviewed Republicans more often. And the USA Today interviewed professionals more often. So what did we learn? We certainly learned a lot at our summit, that managers are concerned with civility in media, and they place value on discussing values, practices, different media sectors, story topics, and legal considerations. All of this discussion led to this study, where we found newspaper coverage of Black Lives Matter indicated national newspapers are creating sustainability by covering this story in different ways. And we also found that using peace journalism is useful and some of the continuums that it contains. We found that some newspapers may be more likely to engage in incompatible coverage to attract audiences and create sustainability. So here are a few distinctions. New York Times appeals to distinct audiences by using more unofficial sources, including protesters. The Wall Street Journal approached coverage from a law and order perspective, appealing to business owners who often had loss of income at stake. And USA Today relied on professional sources, which are more easily available for comment distantly, including doctors, lawyers, professors, public figures in sports and entertainment. USA Today was also more likely to dramatize the conflict. So overall, what we learned, media managers are concerned with binary coverage. We learned computational analysis complements manual analysis. Peace journalism can be useful in these types of studies. Differences do exist at national newspapers. For the future, we want to increase our sample size. We are already collecting data. We've collected data on the Derek Chauvin trial and Black Lives Matter coverage over that period. So we want to expand the scope of peace journalism in future studies using Harlow frames, and we also are very interested in looking at coverage at the local level. So in conclusion, the media have an important role in informing policymakers and the public. Immediate and graphic stories will always tend to take precedence, but there is more that can be done to avoid flaming the fires. And this study indicates that violence and warring themes are not the only ways to cover conflict. Thank you.